Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs. This is Chuck Mason, and we're delighted today to welcome Sharon Hodges. Sharon, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, you're welcome.
Sharon and Chuck are both presidents or past presidents of some of the local societies. So we're going to talk today about immigration and the ship arrivals and how to find your ancestor when you have no idea where they came from. I mean, they're suddenly here.
Yes. And I have some of that way back. Oh,
We
and
do.
Chuck, I borrow
lots
now
of
what
that.
Chuck says. The aliens came and just dropped them as adults. That's how they got here.
Well, that's the way we found Sid's grandparents. They're
there.
in St. Louis.
Yeah.
No idea how
They didn't grow up. They didn't come from anywhere. They're just there.
There,
I
yeah.
like to say it's like Uncle
Magic.
Tom's cabin, like Topsy. I reckon I just grew. That's it. I talk about this in a lot of lectures about the ports that your ancestor may have come in and finding the passenger lists and all, and people say, well, it's online. I don't need to know about this, it's online. Then how come I hear so many people say, I can't find so-and-so? Well, yeah, it is online, but if you've ever looked at some of the way names were written, the first thing I really want to, and I stress this all the time, when you see a passenger list or a manifest, it was not made when they got to this country. The manifest, the passenger list, is made at the point of embarkation, where your ancestor got on the ship. So don't blame it on this end.
Same thing with the name changes.
Yes, did not happen. So when you would see some of those, I hate to say that, odd spelling names, I mean, some that you look at and you can't pronounce no matter how hard you try. Imagine somebody reading this writing, which isn't the best, not necessarily knowing the language, and having to put that into a digital index.
Well, not only that, even if it's a good handwriting, many of the captains were German. If you know the old German letters, the script, it's suddenly totally different.
It is. It's totally different. So you do have problems, even though it has been made easier for us because things are online and there's certain things you can do, you still have problems finding some of where your people came in.
That's why you need to learn the old-fashioned way too.
And that's what I say. You know, I love things being online, but people that start online and don't know how to do it, as Chuck says, the old-fashioned way, as I like to say, back in the dark ages, you lose some of that research technique and how to go about finding things that you can't find online.
I want to give one example. One time somebody said, somebody's told me my grandmother's name was Ophelia, and the name was Sophie. And the moment she said that, I mean, it was back when we only had internet, and I didn't even have to look at it. I know because I know that the old German S looks like our current O. And then you have the P, and then the H came all the way down like an F. It made sense to say Ophelia, but it was Sophie.
And that's part of the problem. And you know what the name is. So when you see it, actually, when you find that passenger list and you see it, you go, well, how could they say such and such? It says,
yeah.
You know, but they don't know that, the people that are putting it in the index.
And men's names, there are many names that are one gender in this country and something else, like Sally is a perfectly good German. I don't know if it's still used, but it certainly was a man's name.
Oh, there's a lot of women now have the men's names. You know. So it helps to know, if you can't find your ancestor, it helps to know as much about them as you can. And not our ancestors, well, most people came in New York.
Yeah.
Not everybody did. And it could be that they didn't because they didn't have a choice. It could have come down to money. It could have come down to, well, I can get a job over here, so why do I want to come into New York? It could be they knew. People wrote home, so they knew how difficult it was to get into a certain point. Now, you say, how could they write home if they didn't know how to write? Well, later on, a lot of the immigration centers had people that would write for you. So anyway, the information would get back, and it would tell you things like, tell Uncle so-and-so not to come through this particular port because he won't pass. But I understand another port is much more lenient. So you want to look at those kinds of things. And what would have affected them. Maybe there was already family out there that you don't know that had already moved to the Midwest, and he wants to get to a port as close to that Midwest as he can. Take a look at those southern ports. Look at New Orleans. Look at Galveston. Look at those ones down there that you think, oh, he wouldn't have gone through there. Sure, he's going to get on the Mississippi and go right up, and there he is. So you also have to remember, what time frame did they come in? Don't go saying they came into a port when, first of all, that port isn't even open yet. Or you say, oh, well, they took the train to such and such, when there's no train, or they were on such a road and that road wasn't built yet. If you're trying to get somebody up the Mississippi River early on, just remember that wasn't going to happen until that, with those old paddle wheelers and all could get up the Mississippi. It wasn't the mighty Mississippi for a reason. You could not take that flat boat that you could take down the Ohio and pole your way up the Mississippi. It didn't work. So you want to take all that kind of thing into consideration.
And I think knowing a little bit about the family and all, and knowing the fact that the costs were different from different places. I was searching for my great-grandparents that came from Scotland, and I don't know why the staff at the National Archives didn't find the index card that I found many years later, but I had written as a part of an assignment for a passenger record, and they couldn't find it. And I knew that my great-grandparents had come into Philadelphia. And I was talking to somebody in a class, and they said, oh, well, my ancestors were from Glasgow, Scotland too, but they came into Baltimore and took the train up. So I looked in Baltimore too, but no, they weren't there. And what I later found out was, yes, my great-grandparents left from Glasgow. Hers went down to Liverpool, and it was cheaper to go from Liverpool to Baltimore and take the train than it was to go to Liverpool to Philadelphia.
One of the things to understand, and you need to do the research of the different ports, but certain ship lines had, I don't want to call them contracts, but they were sort of contracts. They went into certain ports. So around the Irish famine, if your ancestor went into Boston, he probably can't went in on the Cunard line, because he, like mine, although mine didn't go into Boston, but they had, England wanted to get rid of those Irish, and they made an agreement to get, subsidize that ticket. So a lot of the people took advantage of that because it made it cheaper for them into Boston. Or they went into Canada, which another whole story. You didn't want your Irish ancestor going into Canada at that time.
Because that was British.
Well, it was just that it was so, more people died going in there. They called them coffin ships that went up in there. They were that bad.
Oh, yes.
But
Heard about
when you get it, you're talking about Baltimore. In the late 1860s, in Baltimore, it was the North German line, North German Lord line, I believe, that had and this wouldn't be for your Scots, but they actually had an agreement with the B&O Railroad that you could do what I call one-stop shopping. You could get your ship ticket and you could get your train ticket, and it could be that other ships had the same arrangement. But it was cheaper if you bought it all in one. So if you were going to go on and you could get it cheaper, sure, you went into Baltimore rather than New York or someplace else because you could save the money. People say, well, why did they go all the way into New Orleans? It was so much farther, and it was farther. But to get the people to go in, the ship lines made the ticket cheaper.
And there's a book published by Genealogical Publishing Company called Going to America or Coming to America, I forget which, and it tells a lot about what happened, about the different ticket deals and things, the conditions and things, and I read parts of it and I thought, why in the world did my ancestors ever get on the ship? Could it have really been that bad back in Scotland?
Yeah, it was so. People tend to forget that especially those that are, again, I don't want to get into politics, but you didn't leave your place and go looking for something new if it wasn't that bad. Either you were totally discriminated against, or you were so poor you couldn't do something or make a living, or you were a farmer and it had been 3 years of drought and they took your land away. whatever it was, you didn't have any choice. That was the only way that you could.
You need to look at the background and the time frame that your ancestor was leaving. What was going on in that country, and where would they want? Where did they want to go, and why?
Now,
steerage was definitely not like steerage on the movie The Titanic.
No.
No. But now, certain lines service certain countries.
Well,
Like if you knew they were Italian, for instance, you would only look for certain.
Well, it's not necessarily that. It's just to know that that might be a reason why somebody went into Boston or Baltimore after late 1860s if they were going to travel on farther. And the thing to remember is most people who went to a port city didn't necessarily stay in that port city. Within a short period of time, they were gone on to wherever it was they were going. So if it made more sense for them to go that way, if it was cheaper for them to go that way, if the job was closer for them that way, whatever the problem was it the first boat out of wherever that I could get on because I was in trouble kind of a thing I got on.
And that points out one of the things too, understanding the history of the countries,
Yes.
because in a lot of cases, people could not necessarily leave directly from their country to come to the United States. They may have left Germany and gone to France or gone to England to get a boat to come over. I did research for one family years ago where they had the family well documented. The oldest son was Christopher, and I forget what the next oldest son was, but the oldest son was 17 and the next oldest was 16, and they were getting out of Germany, the family story was, because the oldest son was about to be drafted. Well, they couldn't find them. I very easily found them. However, everything was there other than the two sons ages were off. They were a year younger in the family story, and the oldest son was not a son. It was a female, Christina, on the passenger ship. So, my question is, did he actually dress as a female to get out of the country, to get out of Germany? Because if he hadn't, he probably wouldn't have been allowed to go.
And that's the other thing too. Your ancestor might not have left from a port that you would have expected to them have left on. If they lived in Germany, you would expect, and they went out of Bremen, depending on the time, maybe up to Rotterdam. But depending where in Germany they were and the time, they could have gone down through Austria because they were more lax in letting people out that didn't have the proper credentials to get out.
Well, then they would have had to go down to Italy or something after
or
that.
over to Le Havre.
Yeah.
So your ancestor may have gone out a different way because they knew they weren't going to get out properly.
And certainly those from Eastern Europe had to come through, mostly through Germany, to get to a boat.
Yeah, and there was the one Russian port up,
Yeah.
But you have to think of the time of the year too. Could
St.
the ship get
Petersburg.
out?
Yeah.
And so if you can't find your ancestor and you think, all of a sudden people think, okay, he went into New York. Not necessarily. So rethink that. And if you still can't find them online, this is where you still maybe need to go to the National Archives, because take a look at Baltimore. Baltimore kept, for a certain number of years in the early 1800s, but 1830s, something like that, the Baltimore City kept its own records. So you might find them in the Baltimore City records rather than the federal records.
You mean federal doesn't have a copy of it at all?
They separate lists. Now, that's not to say they're not online, but if you go to the National Archives, they're going to be separate lists. And they have an index by Soundex. So people say, why do I need to know Soundex anymore? Because it's online. Well,
Same
here's one of the reasons you need to know it. And you get down to something, somewhere, some repository, you go look at the index, whether it's a vital record or whatever that's not online, and you find the Soundex.
Maybe we ought to explain what Soundex is. It's the first.
It's a way of doing an index for names that sound the same but are spelt differently, and it leaves out vowels and things like H, silent letters. And there's a code that you use.
It starts with the first letter of the last name, and then some number.
Then you take the code, whatever number, you get rid of all your vowels and your H and there's a Z's, I think, or something.
W and Y, I believe.
Yeah, but anyway, there's some to take out, so you mark those out, and then you take the first one. It's like the old game when we were kids. You cross out the names, and this is the person you're going to marry, kind of a thing, you know.
But in addition to that, those work very, very poorly for any Eastern European names.
Hispanic also has their own type of soundex. If you're got a Hispanic surname and you need to use soundex, you need to use the Hispanic.
But that's
soundex.
not. But you have to know the archive one, the U.S. one, in order to do that research. You can't use, like there's a Dej-Mogatov soundex that handles the Eastern European names better. Those with lots and lots of consonants.
You have to use whatever that repository is using.
Has.
You've got to be able to
But you've got to be aware that with Eastern European names, or now you're saying with Hispanic names, it may not work as well as you hope.
Right. And there are some things that don't work quite well. You have to know about the Mac or the Van or Von, whether they stay or go.
And I always tell people with the prefixes, soundex it both ways. But I tell my students, this way you don't have to know whether your Smith family spelled it S-M-I-T-H or S-M-Y-T-H.
Or is it green
You're
with
going
an
to
E or
found
without an E?
E.
But like on Baltimore, Baltimore City goes from 1833 to the mid-1860s. So you want to look at Baltimore City, you want to look at the federal ones. For Massachusetts, for a while, the state of Massachusetts kept its own records as well as the federal. You can go on the Massachusetts State Archives website. They've got an index there that you can use because different people are indexing it. So you want to, just like a census record, you want to use the different databases because different people were indexing. So you might find it on one and not on the other. So you've got to keep in mind what you want to do.
Now, I haven't been online, but if you did this online, let's say you want to go to the New Orleans ones, are they by the city, or how do you, or totally soundexed, or what do you?
Okay, online, depending on the database you use, like Ancestry, you can put up and do similar initials, sounds like kind of a thing. Family Search is great in that it gives you the name, basically what do they find with the way you have it, and then they'll give you other spellings underneath. So it's going to depend on the database that you use, but they're not done by soundex in that way. I know Family Search used to have some, they may still do, that you had to browse. So if you knew the name of the ship, because sometimes your family lore comes down, they came over on ship so-and-so.
Yeah.
And have a time frame they came in, you would browse page by page, but you could do it at home, and that's not so bad. You don't have to go downtown to do it, particularly now that Metro is working on its tracks. But so you want to look at those kinds of things and try all of them, try the different spellings. So they're all different. The one that's probably, I wouldn't say probably, you also need to know for what years are records missing.
Yes.
And there are a lot that are missing, particularly the West Coast. If you have someone that came in, Asian descent, came in through San Francisco, lots of things are missing for San Francisco, for those ports. So you may not find who you're looking for. There are missing times for New Orleans. Each port has something that's probably missing for some port in time. The other thing to remember is, if you have an idea of when your ancestor came in, I'm going back to New Orleans. New Orleans in the before 1850, you didn't want to go in during the summertime. You had cholera, you had yellow fever. Yeah, it was cheap, but there's a good reason why. And basically the business people did not want to have a closed port because it was bad for business. So you have to remember, did my ancestor want to go in to this place during this time? Maybe he did. And if you have people coming from the Caribbean, a lot of the ships would come down and they would go to those islands first and then go into Galveston or into New Orleans. And so you're going to pick up a lot of people from Havana and what have you that went in down there rather than coming up to New York. So you got to know where your ancestor was coming from.
And we're talking ships and all right now, but I happen to think of something. Also, this was done at least in the 1930s, 40s time frame for airplanes coming in, because I had a man contact me. The museum in Germany was doing an exhibit, and they wanted, Marlene Dietrich came in to, I believe it was New York, anyhow, on an airplane, and what they wanted was the page where she was recorded. Unfortunately, the roll of microfilm down at the National Archives wasn't in the drawer. I hunted for a month every time I was down there, and finally I asked a staff member, they couldn't find it, so they had to replace the film, so I had to send him off somewhere else to get a copy of it. But later, did your ancestor come in on a plane in the 20th century?
And that brings up 1924 was the change in how people were processed. 1924, you'll hear people say that's when Ellis Island closed. Don't believe that. That's not true. But it changed the way you came in. So it made it easier for people to come. You were vetted, you were processed in your country, usually at the American Embassy or consulate. You got your papers. So that way, if I had a ship and later an airplane that came in, I could go pretty much anywhere because I didn't have to go through an immigration center if I had valid, good papers. Just today, like customs, people would look at it and over you would go. So that made a difference as to where your ancestor may have come in.
Well, you mentioned Ellis Island too. One of the things we were talking about before we started was the fact that some people are under the impression that everybody came through Ellis Island. It didn't open
even
until
when it's not open yet.
1892 was it?
1891, I believe.
One
of those two.
So prior to that, it was the Port of New York. It was not Ellis Island.
Castle Garden.
Castle Garden, and so I have people that will say to me, well, I need to go to the Ellis Island website to look for my ancestors. Well, what time period? Oh, 1870, it wasn't open. There's nothing there.
Try Castle Garden, which opened in August of 1855. Before that, you can be like my ancestors. You were just let off at the foot of the boundary to fend for yourself, which is not really true. There were immigration societies, immigrant aid societies, all these types. The Jews had a great one.
And I don't know when that started.
A long time ago. I mean, the very first one was actually in Boston I believe it was for like the Scots in the 1690s.
Yeah, I think Hodges started probably in the 1880s with the mass immigration from Eastern Europe.
And when
I'm not sure.
We were talking earlier too about Jews coming in, and if you look at right around 1900 time frame, and you can't find your ancestor, oh, I know he came in through New York. No, go look at Galveston, which people think is very odd, but as we were talking, and you know more about it than I do, there were groups. They didn't want as many in New York on the East Coast for anti-Semitism and whatever other reasons.
The German Jews were very much integrated in society and felt comfortable and were quote educated, more modern than the Eastern Europeans who didn't have that opportunity. And here are coming all of these people with these old customs, and they didn't want them, and because they didn't want to start anti-Semitism.
And they forget that their great-grandmother had that same problem.
but at least they were German, and the Germans were more culturally similar to perhaps the British than these Eastern Europeans whose language was so strange and all of that. And so many of them somehow, and I don't know the details of how, they sent them to Galveston, and then they had cooperatives in the what we now call Midwestern states that they had started and shipped them up there, and whether they stayed there or not, that was something else afterwards. But at least it got them out of New York, and they weren't bothered by it as much.
One more thing to talk about is the border crossings of Canada and Mexico, where people are coming into Canada, then coming into the United States or Mexico. St. Albans crossings in St.
Does not
Albans
mean
is
everybody crossed in
Vermont.
St.
It-
Albans,
no,
Vermont.
No, I did work. I first was introduced to them. Someone looking for them coming into Washington State, but they were very similar records. But they were, for the most part, early on at least, index cards
Right.
that had the same information. But again, I've run into people that will say, "Oh, well, my ancestors came in, but I can't find them in there," until we got tougher with laws and all. They could have
1895.
also walked across the border anywhere and not been documented coming in.
Yeah, we didn't start getting any documentation until 1895 with Canada, and not till like 1905, 1906 with Mexico. But right, just we have people crossing today. You just cross the border. I mean, if you were out in Montana, you know, you could just walk across. And you, even with then, when we started getting trains and ferries and all that people came across on, you don't get necessarily, if someone went into Canada and then took a ship, I think ferries also had the manifest, but like a lot of the trains did not have manifest. You showed your papers in Canada, you got this little admission thing into the United States, you got on the train, you showed the mat, and you got off at the other end. There was no manifest to look for.
Well, look at I don't know. I haven't been up to Canada in the last few years. I mean, you could just cross the border at any time, you know. And
Oh, I remember going as a kid. You just showed your driver's license, said I'm American, you know, or whatever.
Now you need a passport.
passport.
Yeah, well,
Now you need a passport.
So, you know, those are the type things, you've got to know the history of the area, what was going on at the time, and don't assume your ancestor came in through New York when maybe he didn't. And don't assume it was Ellis Island when it wasn't open.
well, it just, you know, that's the in thing for everybody to look at, and
That's the
what
romantic thing. Oh,
Yeah.
they came through Ellis Island. They went to the kissing gate when they met their relatives, you know.
Well, thank you so very
Oh,
much.
you're welcome.
I think we've talked, you know, hopefully we've helped some people who can't find their ancestors. It's given me some other ideas.
Do go back to the National Archives when necessary.